So this then is the potential triple win. And to date, we have results from field trials as well as greenhouse studies that show support that we can maintain crop production with Struvite while decreasing the loss of dissolved reactive phosphorus, or DRP. The way that we propose to do this is to look at the extraction of phosphorus from a point source in a form called Struvite. Struvite is a mineral form of phosphorus. It's known as magnesium ammonium phosphate. We can extract it from a point source, and then we can use it as a fertilizer in the non-point sources, i.e. agricultural fields. So today, I want to share with you some of my lab's work that has been funded by NREC, and I want to highlight some of the outcomes of the investments made by NREC on how we can have our cake and eat it too. This is what we're calling a triple win for phosphorus. And as we'll see, it basically means that we can decrease P losses from point sources as well as from the non-point sources while maintaining crop production. So this is the basis of an award made 2 years ago. We're halfway through a 4-year project. And the main PIs on this project are myself and Dr. Kusik, a wastewater engineer. And you might be wondering, why is a soil scientist working with a wastewater engineer? It sounds like the start of a bad joke of two people walking to a bar, etc. But as we'll see in just a second, there's a very good reason why we're working with wastewater engineers when it comes to phosphorus in agriculture in this state. Before I get started, I want to thank those who've been involved in this work. This includes the phosphorus members of my lab, graduate students and a postdoc who have been fully or in part supported by NREC funds, as well as our partners, most of all the Isermans up in LaSalle County. They have graciously allowed us onto their fields for an on-farm trial of Struvite, and as well as IFB. They're the ones who put us in touch with the Isermans in the first place. Also thanks to our corporate collaborators, Ostera, as well as OCP. Ostera is the main producer of Struvite in the US. We'll talk about what Struvite is in just a second. OCP is the world's biggest phosphate rock mining company. So our lab works with both of them. They're not part of the proposal with NREC, but they do provide some insights that have informed this work. I want to start by giving some perspective on phosphate fertilizer globally, but also in our state of Illinois. So what you're looking at here is a diagram of, on the x-axis, time, so going back to 1800s, and then on the y-axis, the amount of phosphorus that's being added to agricultural systems as an input. And as you can see, the main source of P inputs until about the 1940s was largely shown here in green, the recycling of manure, or human waste as well. And it wasn't until about post-World War II that we had net inputs of phosphorus in the form of fertilizers that were manufactured from phosphate rock. It was on this campus in about 1910 that the godfather of soil fertility, Cecil Hopkins, developed the first working knowledge that phosphorus was as critical as nitrogen as a crop food source. So he did some basic studies shown here on the inset photo, demonstrating that phosphorus also has to be added to support crop yields, not just nitrogen. Now, the way that farmers were supporting increased crop yields was largely by phosphate rock, but by the 1940s, it was forms of fertilizer that were derived from the phosphate rock, so things like MAP, DAP, or TSP. And that's what you see as the main driver of the increased mining of phosphate rock, shown in red after 1940. So phosphate rock is a geological deposit. All phosphate fertilizer ultimately comes from one of these. 95% of these phosphate rock ores are located in North Africa, mostly in Morocco. And what we do is that we mine that phosphate rock, and then we concentrate it into a form like MAP, DAP, or TSP. Now today, we've come a long way, obviously, from say 1910 to present day in terms of how much phosphorus is being added, but also in the overall nutrient use efficiency of phosphorus. Our state is one of the better performing states in the nation when it comes to phosphorus use efficiency, or PUE. Upwards of 80% PUE is estimated for Central and North Illinois, according to the USDA. So that would be unit of P added as a fertilizer for crop uptake. At the same time, though, we have some of the higher contributions of phosphate to the Mississippi. And this might seem like a paradox. We have high efficiency of usage, and yet we have relatively high losses. And this comes to the double-edged sword of phosphate, is that a little bit goes a long way when it comes to compromised water quality. So we may have even 95% efficiency, but that 5% that gets lost to surface water can contribute to pretty high amounts of compromised quality. So then the proposition that I want to make is that of the triple win. By the triple win, what our lab means is, can we further tighten this efficiency to decrease losses? And the triple win has three components. One is that we can decrease P losses from point sources, but also at the same time from the non-point sources, while also maintaining crop productivity. The reason, or the way that we would do this then, is by transferring phosphorus from a point source to the non-point source. So we're talking about physically capturing phosphate coming out of a pipe in a way that it can be used as a fertilizer, and it has a chemistry such that it's less prone to losses once being used in a field. So first, let's talk about whether this is possible. You might be thinking this sounds really cute, but what do the numbers say in terms of the possibility of capturing point P to use it as a P source in the non-point? There's been some modeling work done now about 4 years ago that modeled the corn belt in our state specifically is very well suited to recycling phosphorus from point source and reusing it in co-located non-point sources, i.e. ag fields. And this has to do with the simple fact that lots of cities and point sources like grain mills are in close proximity to the agricultural fields that could reuse that phosphorus. So think about our state. We've got grain mills like in Decatur. We also have the third biggest city in the country up in Chicago. So these are big point sources, and right outside of the point sources, or right next to them, we've got the non-point sources that could reuse that phosphorus. Now, this study that modeled the potential reuse of point source P found that theoretically, the Midwest could be completely self-sufficient for all of its phosphorus needs. So all crop P needs could be met if we, quote, simply recaptured point source P. Again, this is a theoretical proposition, so our lab's work is taking this to task and seeing or fleshing out, well, how far could we get towards that end? Okay, so we began modeling with the wastewater engineers just how much point source phosphorus could be captured. This is called a Sankey diagram. It's simply a way of showing all the flows of phosphorus. Don't get too caught up in the details. The point here is to focus on the recoverable P that is not recovered currently. So that's a pretty big chunk of total P inputs, meaning that roughly half of our current nationwide phosphorus fertilizer usage could be substituted by phosphorus from point sources. This is now a US scale, not for the state. The point is that there's a huge opportunity, both in dollars and in point source mitigation, if we're to use phosphate coming out of pipes and using it as a P source. So that's the feasibility. There's a high potential, theoretically, to transfer phosphorus from point source to non-point source. But why might we really want to do this? It's not just feasible. I would argue that it's perhaps necessary. So there's three salient reasons, plus a fourth one. First is that this is a way to truly couple in a symbiosis the mitigation of P loss from point source and non-point source. Second is that point source reductions might be more of a low-hanging fruit than non-point source. Point source, by definition, is an exact spot that we can intervene and capture that phosphate. And third is that by physically capturing phosphate from point sources, you have a tangible, a fungible form of P that can be the basis of water quality trading programs, as is being proposed in some states like Minnesota. I think a fourth point that's not as critical, but it still bears consideration, is that having phosphorus that's produced locally in our state or in the US makes us less dependent on foreign phosphate rock. Less than 1% of all the phosphate rock mines are located in this country. And so by decoupling ourselves from foreign phosphate rock, we're less prone to international P prices. So let's talk about how could we go about achieving this triple win. So the main word that I want you to take away from today is struvite. So struvite is the physical form, it's a mineral of phosphate, and it's the way that phosphate can be stripped out of water from a point source. And then that mineral form of phosphate can be re-added to soils as a fertilizer, i.e. in the non-point sources. So struvite is a mineral. It's ammonium magnesium phosphate. So it's a 5-28-0 fertilizer. It's not that water soluble, less than 2%, but it is moderately citrate soluble, meaning that plant roots via their exudates can solubilize it. This has led to the term of root activated, meaning that as the crop root biomass grows, as it comes into proximity with struvite, it will give off exudates that will then solubilize struvite. In other words, there's a biomimicry, there's a synchronization of when you need the phosphate and its dissolution. More root biomass, more dissolution. The way that we generate phosphate from the point sources is that we dope the wastewater with magnesium, and then we form these precipitates, these salts that fall out of solution. So therein lies the advantage of struvite as a way of stripping out phosphate from point sources. Here's more of a comparison between struvite and a common phosphorus fertilizer, that of MAP. So they're almost opposites, right? The Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I won't say which is which. But the key thing here is that MAP is largely water soluble, and it's the opposite case for struvite. It's not that water soluble, less than 2%, but it is soluble in the presence of citrate. So the whole idea is that they undergo different mechanisms of solubilization. With MAP, you add it to soil, and with water, it will dissolve pretty quickly. In contrast, struvite won't dissolve in the presence of water, which is an advantage if you think about fall-applied phosphorus. It'll sit there, it'll hold tight, and not dissolve until there's a crop root present. But it will dissolve then with citrate, and over time, there's a mechanism for its slow release. The triple win then that is offered by struvite is that struvite is a way that we can physically capture phosphate from a point source. And because it's citrate but not water soluble, it can better synchronize with crop needs for phosphorus. So here's a way that it can maintain crop production or maybe even improve it. And the third benefit is that it can potentially decrease phosphate losses from the non-point sources, i.e. off-farm. Again, because it will not simply dissolve and wash off as DRP when it's fall applied. Now there's of course a drawback here is that it's such low water solubility that it may not necessarily meet early crop P needs. So now this is a false dichotomy if you think that we either have to go cold turkey and drop MAP and DAP and go full struvite. There's a possibility here of being creative and using blends. So can we have blends or mixtures of MAP or DAP with struvite to achieve the best bets? This then is the task of our NREC project, is to, for the conditions of our state's production systems, what is the optimum ratio of struvite to MAP that can maintain crop production while minimizing P losses? So I'll say that this has been broadly discussed in terms of the feasibility of using struvite. The idea is not new. There's been lots of discussions on how this might play out, a lot of modeling. So here's a recent example that we looked at the feasibility of using struvite globally. Again, the idea is that we can decrease P losses from point sources. And if you hone into the Midwest, we find that there's this sort of neutral suitability of struvite. So some parts of the country shown in red are not suitable for struvite because they have alkaline soils. Struvite does not dissolve very well in alkaline soils. In the Midwest, we're circumneutral pH, so it's sort of this edge of, or fence post where it could go either way. So that was our question for this NREC work, was how suitable is struvite for Illinois to achieve this triple win for phosphorus loss mitigation? So the very first step of our work, which we've completed, is understanding what has been done on struvite. There's been a lot of greenhouse studies, and there's been a lot of propositions, but not very much field work. And that was our first finding, shown on the bottom left-hand side. We did a systematic lit review and meta-analysis, and what we found was that most studies, 78%, were greenhouse-based. And 1% of research was at the field scale with yield data. So a lot of talk about Struvite, but very little evidence on how well can it perform to support crop yields. Second, we found that there was a very big bias in soil types. Greenhouse work tends to be done with sandy textures, because if you've ever tried to pot a clay soil for a greenhouse work, you know it can be a nightmare. So for the soil types of our state, there wasn't much out there. Then we moved to the greenhouse, and we moved to the greenhouse as a first step to understand what conditions or what kind of ratio should we use in the field scale. So we're not stopping at the greenhouse. It is an intermediate step. Here we tested things like the granule size, we tested the ratios, and we tested the placement of struvite granules through the vegetative stage of corn and soybean. And what we found was that there is support for the hypothesis that struvite can maintain yield while decreasing residual soil test P, i.e. the amount of phosphorus that could be prone to losses after crop harvest. So here's the first chunk of evidence on the left, and that's showing that going up to 50% struvite, 50% MAP, maintains through V12 above ground corn biomass growth. And at the same time, shown in the red bracket, we can decrease the amount of soil test P that remains in the topsoil by almost 20%. So the scenario here is that you've harvested the corn crop, and even though you've got the same above ground growth, you have 20% less DRP that might be susceptible to loss from the topsoil. But again, this is greenhouse work, and it's not yield-based. Now, we went to the field. I'll talk about that in just a second, but as a quick example of evidence for how struvite doesn't really dissolve right away, here are some photos from the Azurman farm up in LaSalle County showing that when we apply struvite, there's still visual evidence for the granules persisting. So we've got shown here from winter, the 4 seasons, that there's still remnant granules, again supporting that it's not going to dissolve right away. And what we found from a different study was that about 60% of struvite dissolves within the growing season if it's broadcast. And however, these granules are not the same in the winter as in the fall. So what you're seeing on the right-hand side now, part A and part B, it's kind of hard to see, but the texture of the struvite granule looks different. We're finding that even though that those granules are still present, the physical weathering of the granule has changed. So the struvite might still be persistent, it's still more available for the next growing season. So the final step of this work that we're in the middle of right now, we're going into the second growing season, is understanding at the field scale, can struvite support crop yield while also decreasing soil loss risk as residual STP? We proposed looking at corn and soy and focusing on these blends. Again, the hypothesis is that there's an optimum blend of struvite to ammonium phosphates. Looking at the timing, fall versus spring, the placement, banding, or broadcasting, and then how that might interact with tillage. And tillage is worthwhile because we know that if you broadcast and you till, there's more surface contact of the granule with soil, so that might expedite the growing. In terms of the placement, if we place the struvite in the root zone, it might further better synchronize the root exudate mechanism of solubilizing the struvite granule. So for this, we did a typical corn-soy crop rotation here on campus, adding about 50 kgs of phosphate as struvite, or rather as the struvite MAP blend. And what we found basically for the last year's growing season was that there was no effect of the struvite to MAP ratio on corn yield. And we had a bigger effect of tillage, whether we had no-till or conventional till, on crop yield. So what you're seeing here is on the left is corn yield across on the x-axis, the struvite to MAP ratios. On the right-hand figure, we have the same ratios now under no tillage. Excuse me, so conventional tillage on the left, no tillage on the right. But the whole point here is that we've got noisy responses, but there's a bigger effect of how you till than what percent of struvite you have in the struvite to map blend. This is overall good news because it means that you can go up to 50% struvite, or in this case, 75%, have a decrease in soil test P after harvest, and have no appreciable effect on corn yield. So again, support for this hypothesis that we can use struvite as a slow release form that doesn't compromise yield but might decrease DRP loss risk. Now, in our proposal, we had feedback from the NREC panel that one site is nice, but could you maybe do a couple more? Soil types are different, climate types are different. So we added a couple more sites, one also in Urbana, but looking now at a double crop wheat soybean system, and also one up in LaSalle County with the Azurmans looking at a corn soybean system. So we added 2 more crops. Now we had wheat and soybean in the same year, and we have a different site as well, different soil type. So here what we found, before I go on, so in total now we have 3 field sites. We just finished the first year of both. And altogether, we have about 25% of soil types directly represented by these 3 different field sites. Okay, so we are looking at here the results of the double crop wheat to soybean system. I'll say that it was a pretty bad year for double cropping wheat and soybean. Our soybean yields were atrocious because of the late planting. But that said, we found that there was overall no significant difference in wheat or soybean yield when we went all the way to full struvite. So no map, just pure struvite. Now this might seem, well, there might be some questions as to why this is. And what we think it is that there's enough soil test P that's been banked up that the crop is able to draw upon STP reservoirs, not just on struvite, to enable a full switch from map to struvite. So that would be, for example, the 100-0, that's the pure struvite treatment. Now, these conditions are realistic for our state. What you're looking at here is on the left, the US, and on the right, Illinois. These are STP values that have been compiled by IPNI. And the representative STP values for our 2 Urbana sites for the corn and then for the double crop wheat system are shown bracketed in blue. What we're finding is that if we have a less P deficient site, so more STP, we can go full switch cold turkey into struvite and not have to use any MAP in the blend. In contrast, if we have a lower amount of STP, it makes sense that we can go only up to about a 75% struvite, i.e. 25% MAP blend. In other words, for the conditions that are typical of our state, we have a possibility of bumping up the ratio of struvite to MAP. And to the extent that we have a decreased loss via DRP from a higher struvite blend, we can go, well, we can maximize upon that. This is all to say then that struvite might be thought of as a right source in the 4 R's of phosphorus. So as a bit of background, there's not too many options in the US or in our state for different sources of phosphorus. 88% of all P sources, or at least P fertilizer sales, are in the form of ammonium phosphates. And there's not much room to play with the chemistry for slow release, like there is for nitrogen. So what we're proposing as part of this NREC work is that struvite might offer a strategy, or at least another option, of a different source of phosphorus. Again, either by itself or more likely as a blend with these commonly used ammonium phosphates. So, in summary, the triple win for phosphorus that we've been pitching is that we can decrease P losses from the point sources. Working with wastewater engineers, we can strip out phosphate from a pipe. Second, we can then decrease it from the non-point source by reusing that captured phosphorus in the form of struvite. Again, because it has less water solubility, there's less loss of DRP. And then the third proposition of the triple win is that we can maintain crop yield, which under the typical soil and STP conditions of our state, we're finding so far from our field trials is in fact feasible. Key to this again is struvite, but I'll say that there's other forms of phosphorus that can be recovered from point sources. In the EU, there's a lot of work being done on iron and aluminium as a way to strip out phosphate. This gets you lower P, rather that achieves greater P removal from a point source, but iron phosphates are not that soluble at all, even with citrate. So struvite is of a chemistry such that we probably have the best trade-off between taking it out of the point source and then reusing it as a fertilizer. So again, struvite is the currency of transferring P from point source to non-point in a way that is amenable to crop production goals. As a next step, we're going to finish up the second round of these field trials and then do an economic assessment. One question that you may have in mind is, well, what's the cost of struvite? It is more than MAP or DAP per unit phosphorus, but that's with the current pricing as a fertilizer by these companies. And so you might think that there's room here for cost abatement programs where point sources might be able to sell struvite to displace some of the costs of the recovery. So there's, I think, big potential to think about struvite as a way to leverage a symbiosis between a point source and a non-point source in our state. So with that, I'll take any questions, and thank you for your time.